startup business that focuses on simplifying complex legal and business information into simple diagrams. And so the way that I learned about how one-page thinking functions is through a metaphor. So for a second, I would like the audience to think that you're in New York City right now and that you see a really tall skyscraper. And on the skyscraper, there's three main floors: the ground floor, the middle floor, and the top floor. And each one of these floors actually represents a different level of communication. So for example, the ground floor level information is when information is too complex or really complicated to understand. So for example, say I ask someone in the audience, could you explain to me how the United States government is structured? Ground floor level communication, a sample response for that would be to hand me a constitution or the Bill of Rights, Federalist 55 papers. These foundational documents that may answer the question, but it's way too complicated because there's too much information. On the other side, top floor level information is when information is too simple or there's simply not enough information. So similarly, say I ask you the same question, could you explain to me the United States government? And you tell me that there's three branches. Again, this form of communication isn't effective because there isn't enough detail to that answer. And so what one-page thinking likes to call the sweet spot is the middle floor. And that's where the necessary information that is complex is shown, but it's also shown in a simple format. So that leads me into my internship experience. My mentor, Mr. Les Perret, is a Harvard Law grad, and he is an extremely knowledgeable man, and he taught me a lot about the business world. Throughout this process, I learned from him how to analyze 10K documents, proxy statements, and other really important documents in the business world. I also had the opportunity to contribute in team meetings. So this would be every Wednesday afternoon. The entire one-page thinking team would come together, and we would be able to talk about specific matters about the company. I'd be able to get feedback from my projects and also give feedback to other people's projects. And the main project that I was working on at One Page Thinking was a project called Business Ecosystem Diagrams. And business ecosystem diagrams are essentially taking a business and researching everything about that business through looking through the 10Ks and proxy statements, gathering all the important information, and then putting that into a diagram. So the next slide here is actually my business ecosystem diagram that I created for DuPont de Nemours, a Delaware corporation. And essentially to create this, I had to scour hours upon hours looking through the 10K, proxy statements, financial statements, a lot of different important business information, and I compiled all that important information into one diagram. And I know at first glance this may look extremely complicated, but keep in mind that this is information from a bunch of different documents, and that a 10K could go upwards of around 100 to 200 pages. And also keep in mind that this is a picture, and that if you were to open this up on a PDF, you'd be able to zoom into certain parts and really connect the relationships. So that brings me to my research project and what exactly I was looking for. So the key part of my research was communication. So communication follows a system called the transactional model. And the transactional model, believe it or not, is actually something that is happening right now between myself and the audience right now. Right now, as I'm speaking, the words that I'm saying are going to your brain and you're interpreting them through your own subjective lenses. And if this is done effectively within a business, the benefits are endless. Just to name a few benefits, stronger team environments, improved leadership skills, and more productive work environments are just a few of the good benefits that could come from good, effective communication. But the transactional model can actually also get extremely complex the more and more factors that you add to it. So if you could imagine, if I increase the number of people, different genders, different races, backgrounds, languages, the more factors that I add into it, the transactional model becomes more and more complex. And the more complex the transactional model becomes, the higher chance of miscommunication there is. And miscommunication is the incorrect interpretation of information conveyed from another person. And to emphasize how important communication really is in a project setting, a study in 2017 talked about how out of 134 teams, 95% of them believed that communication was a must for success. And to talk a little bit about the importance of the study, as we know, in the last 20 years, we've been in the middle of the digital age. So we've seen new applications like Microsoft Office, Adobe Cloud, and Google Suite being used more and more within businesses. And because of that, we've also been able to see a shift towards visuals. And a study actually stated that the shift towards visuals in society has actually helped supplement both communication and comprehension. And in that same study, it actually talked about how visual diagrams actually enhances a participant's spatial understanding. And spatial understanding is basically how a participant views an object and is able to determine its size, location, and depth. And so here is a picture of my research map. On the left, I have my basic subproblem, and on the right, I have my two applied subproblems. My basic subproblem asked, how has communication changed over the course of the technological era in business? And to answer this question, I consulted 3 to 5 credible sources on what exactly the effect of new technologies had on communication and business. And they all talked about how outlets like phone technology, video conferencing, and overall using laptops have been extremely crucial within a business, as we can see, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of local and corporate businesses are shutting down. Zoom is becoming a really common use because it is able to bridge the gap with that virtual communication. For my two applied subproblems, I'll go into more in depth when I talk about my results and my methodology. But one of them was, is there a preference for the visual one-page thinking diagram, the annual report on the 10K, or both in learning about a business? And the other one being, what are the effects of not being able to comprehend important business information, and how exactly do they affect the business? So to answer these questions, I split up my methodology into 2 separate parts. One being the pre-planning stage, where I set up everything necessary, for my second part, which is the interview and data collection stage. So an example of what I would do during the pre-planning stage is I devised a list of supplementary questions that would best help supplement my applied subproblems. So by that, I mean that I'm asking additional questions on top of the applied subproblems that help me gather more insight and why exactly a participant feels a certain way on a specific answer for an applied subproblem. Talking a little bit more on how exactly I conducted this experiment, I created a Google Drive folder with 5 separate subfolders, each containing its own business. So the 5 businesses were DuPont de Nemours, Whirlpool, ConocoPhillips, Northrop Grumman, and Union Pacific Railroad. And each one of these subfolders had their own respective 10K documents and one-page thinking ecosystem diagrams, as well as a Google Forms quiz that stayed constant across all 5 of them. Talking about how exactly I got my participation for this research project, I had the opportunity to interview 3 people who were clients/colleagues of Mr. Pratt and One Page Thinking, and 2 participants who were not clients of One Page Thinking. And so talking about my interview collection and my data collection, participants were given 5 minutes to observe each question and answer questions on the Google Forms. So the Google Forms was not used for the results of the experiment, rather it was used as a guiding line for participants when they're looking through the different forms of information. This was because the 10K document and the one-page thinking diagram have so much information in it that it's impossible for them to be able to make a conclusion if they're not given a specific guide. And so my mentor and I agreed that 5 minutes was an appropriate amount of time to answer the questions that I created for each section. And so participants were given 5 minutes to answer questions specifically for the 10K document, 5 minutes to answer questions specifically for the one-page thinking diagram, and then 5 minutes to answer questions with both. And then after that, the interview would start, where I would ask the applied subproblems and the supplementary questions, and then I would code that data both axially and axially and openly, which is essentially looking for any commonalities and trends within the responses. So talking about the scope of the study and why this study is reliable, I worked with Mr. Les Pratt and confirmed and discussed my results with the one-page thinking team. And the results were valid because I interviewed reputable people in the business and legal world. So actually, one of the participants that I interviewed was a colleague of Mr. Les Pratt that's based all the way in California, working at a legal firm called Sidley. So it was really cool that I was able to get insights from people all across the United States. A really important assumption that I had to take for this research project was that participants had little to no pre-existing knowledge about the topic. So when I asked participants to choose between those 5 businesses in the beginning, I'm asking them to choose the business they felt like they knew the least about. And I'm assuming that they don't know that much information about the topic. An important delimitation that I took for this experiment was that only one-page thinking diagrams and 10K documents will be considered. So while there are probably a lot of different diagram formats out in the world and different text documents, for this research project, only one-page thinking diagrams and 10K documents will be considered. Going into the results of my first applied sub-problem, the preference routine information types, right off the bat, I realized across all the interview responses that they all said that the 10K document had way too much information and that it was too long of a document and it was really complicated to understand. On the other hand, responses for the one-page thinking diagram talked more about how it was really neat and had a good format, and it was really easy to connect relationships. But also some cons for the one-page thinking diagram were that the people that were not cons of one-page thinking also talked about how it was complicated to understand at first glance, as you guys also saw when I showed my Dupont de Dumas diagram. And so 80% of the participants preferred the one-page thinking diagrams, and 20% of them preferred both the one-page thinking diagrams and the 10K document. So going into more in depth of the analysis of the information types, 4 out of 5 participants that I interviewed talked about how they preferred the one-page thinking diagram. That's an overwhelming amount of support for the diagram. Meanwhile, not a single person said that they preferred only the 10K document when learning about a business, as only one person talked about how they would prefer both the one-page thinking diagram and the 10K document. And again, all 5 participants made mention of the clean organization of the diagrams, and 4 out of the 5 participants made mention about the length of the 10K and how it was weight and how it made it difficult to comprehend. So I hypothesized that participants would prefer both the one-page thinking diagram and the 10K document because I felt like any information that wasn't covered from the one-page thinking diagram, they could consult the 10K. But this was actually rejected by the interviews because only 1 out of the 5 participants preferred to use both forms of information. And this was mainly just because of the 10K's length and complexity, and that because the one-page thinking diagram was so neat and simple, there was no reason to consult the 10K in the first place. So talking about my second applied subproblem, the effects of not being able to comprehend important business information and miscommunication as a whole, all 5 participants agreed that miscommunication decreases across multiple factors. Just to name a few: productivity, job satisfaction, efficiency, and a worsened team environment. They also talked about the emotional effects that miscommunication had on them. So feelings of frustration, embarrassment, and feelings of stress were really common responses across the interviews. It was also interesting to note that 60% of the participants experienced miscommunication on a frequent basis. So on the bottom here, I have a couple of quotes that I drew from my interviews, and one of them talked about how one of the participants had a fight with a colleague because of misinformation. And because of that, there was a lot of wasted time. And as we know in business, time equals money. So that was really interesting. Another quote talked about how when one of the participants felt like they were stuck, they actually resorted to diagramming to try and figure out solutions, because when they diagrammed, they were able to connect certain relationships within the business. So that helped them get back on their feet, to say it. And then another quote talked about how miscommunication occurred so frequently within the business that their team actually adapted to that and is more cooperative and supportive. But in the beginning processes, they noted that it was a really frustrating process to be a part of. So again, a little bit more analysis into the miscommunication effects. All 5 participants noted those negative effects on those factors that I talked about in the last slide, as well as those negative emotions like frustration. And also, it was cool to know that all 5 participants have experienced miscommunication at work at some point in their career. So that just speaks on levels on how relevant this project is and how this is actually a common problem within the business world. And so I hypothesized that the effects of not being able to comprehend important business information and miscommunication effects as a whole would have negative effects. And this was supported by the interviews, as all 5 participants agreed that it decreased across those 5 factors that I discussed, as well as those negative emotions that were inflicted and the fact that they all experienced the miscommunication in the past. And so what exactly does this imply? So this study implies that the use of diagrams are heavily preferred over textual documents. So what could this mean in the future? That could be that the use of diagrams are going to slowly overtake the strong use of textual documents. So maybe in the future we may see a Microsoft Word, but it's more diagram-oriented than text-oriented. Some interesting future work and studies that could be done to build off of this could be to actually test the comprehension of participants from both types of information. So this could be done with a pre-test, post-test like format. It'd also be cool to see how exactly this research would expand to multiple industries and also across the United States and across the world. because different geographical regions may respond differently to this. So legacy and what I learned. Again, I learned so much about the business world and exactly how much and how it operates. I've also had an opportunity to create a lot of different connections. Funny story, there's actually another intern at One Page Thinking who goes to Kennesaw Mountain, who's enrolled in the same class as us, research and internship. So I thought that was really cool. And also I was able to interview Mr. Pratt's colleagues who are all across the United States, like the one that was in Sidley and California, and then I interviewed a few people in Kansas. So that was also really cool. And then I also learned the importance of communication and teamwork. These are soft skills that are not really emphasized in a school environment because school is really self-driven. But throughout this process, I've been able to understand how important communication and teamwork and collaboration really is. And then finally, I actually was able to gain professional working experience, and I learned a lot about project management. And so acknowledgements, again, I want to thank Mr. Les Pratt, Mr. Shannon Curring, and all of the One Page Thinking team for guiding me throughout this long research journey, as well as Dr. Cody, Dr. Deason, and Ms. Gainsford for helping me as well throughout this process. Are there any questions?
Mute link.
Wait a minute, can you go back to, I guess it was your methodology for your first applied subproblem?